All right, it's time to place on your glasses as we are now going to leave the two-dimensional world and enter the wild world of 3D. The screen darkens. The year is 1983, and we will now witness 3 of the 3D films that jumped out of the screen that year. We will discuss Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, Jaws 3D, and Metalstorm, The Destruction of Jared-Syn. Join us as we travel across dimensions to the year 1983 inside my dad's video store. Joining me, as always, to discuss the films are my partner in cinematic crime, Gray Creasy. What's new, Mr. Gray?
Yeah, not a lot. One thing that's really exciting was due to our good buddy Jason Shawn, I got to watch Metalstorm and Jaws 3 in 3D, which was really cool. The only downshot was I watched them with the active 3D glasses. So, I had this big chunky piece of machinery on my head. So making physical notes was pretty much impossible. So I had to just have my voice recorder going on my phone, which was both kind of fun and kind of like extra homework because I had to play
just
back.
Transcribe it after.
I had to transcribe it with my Bluetooth speaker later, my notes. But it was great watching him actually in 3D because I got to make specific notes on how the 3D worked for each movie. I wish I could have done it with Spacehunter because I love Spacehunter, but yeah, it was cool. It was cool.
Awesome. That is so cool. That is so neat. Well, Waylon is not joining us this month, but we have a very, very special guest. Joining me is my good friend and the proprietor of 3D Space, the Center for Stereoscopic Photography, Art, Cinema, and Education, Eric Kurland. Eric, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Brad. It's great to see you. Thanks for inviting me to be here.
It's wonderful to see you. Oh my gosh. Now, folks, we have a true expert on 3D here. Eric, could you kind of talk about this? Because I've known you for almost 20 years now, and I remember even before you started the 3D space, you loved 3D. You were really into it. So what was it about 3D that made you so interested in the art of 3D photography?
Well, I've loved 3D since I was a kid. I guess I've worn eyeglasses since I was about 3 years old. And sometime around age 5, I was given a Viewmaster, the plastic viewer. You put the reel in and you can flip through 7
Oh, yeah. Favorite toy.
Yeah. And because I wore glasses and my left eye was weaker than my right, I always closed my left eye when I looked into the Viewmaster. So I didn't know they were 3D. Mm-hmm. And after maybe 2 or 3 years, one day I was looking into the Viewmaster, and for some reason I opened my left eye while I was looking in. And I distinctly remember it was an image of Popeye and Olive Oil with these little hearts floating over their heads. and the picture, Popeye literally popped into 3D for me. And I had this revelation that this is how you look at these. And I ran all over the house to find every reel that I had to see if they all did this. But there was something so magic about being able to see this 3D picture. And then I found there were 3D comic books, and I had a book with a 3D lenticular on the cover, and there were 3D movies. And any time I could get something that had 3D in it, I would get that. And that just started collecting things. It wasn't until I was, maybe 30 years old that it occurred to me I could actually take my own 3D pictures, and started experimenting with 3D photography and 3D video, and ended up finding here in LA the LA 3D Club that was founded back in 1955. It still meets monthly and is a group of 3D photographers and collectors and enthusiasts that sort of just build this community of 3D people. Got involved with that, met a gentleman named Ray Zone, who was known as the king of 3D comic books. Ray was a 3D historian and a filmmaker himself. He kind of took me under his wing, taught me everything he knew about 3D, and I just kind of went from there.
Wow, that is so charming and fascinating too. I didn't even know about this sort of 3D society that was here in LA and stuff before you started the 3D space. Can you talk a little bit, kind of bring our audience up to this point in 1983, where there was this small sort of resurgence of 3D movies during that year until 1983? Could you kind of give us sort of a brief sort of history of 3D, like in terms of cinema and like how it kind of came in and came out of fashion and whatnot?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, 3D image creation, people don't realize this, actually goes all the way back to the mid-19th century.
Wow.
There was a British scientist named Sir Charles Wheatstone who wrote a paper in 1838 theorizing how we see depth in the world, that because we've got two eyes that are set about 2.5 inches apart that see two different views of the world, but we only perceive one image with depth. He figured out that our brain takes the two things that our eyes see, fuses them together, and takes those parallax differences between left and right and interprets that as depth. So the 3D is actually all in your head. Yeah. He proved it. He built this big contraption on a tabletop that had mirrors and a place to put drawings. He drew shapes from two different perspectives, put them into his device, looked into the mirrors, and saw the left side drawing in his left eye, the right side drawing in his right eye, and the shape became a cone or a cube or a sphere or whatever shape he'd drawn. That proved his theory. He actually coined the term stereoscopic. He called his device the stereoscope, and stereoscopic comes from the Greek. Scopic meaning to see, and stereo actually means solid or in relief. So stereoscopic is to see something with volume. A year later, William Henry Fox Talbot invented the first photochemical photography process. And so 3D and photography were both born right around the same time. So all through the 1850s and into the 1860s, photographers were experimenting with how to take a left photo and a right photo and view them stereoscopically. Really actually became a thing in 1851. There was another scientist named Sir David Brewster. He had an exhibition at the Great Exhibition of London at the Crystal Palace and showed his handheld stereoscope. It was he actually shrunk the whole thing down into a box you could carry around. He looked into lenses, and he put glass slides in the back. Actually, a lot like the Viewmaster. Yeah. And the story goes that Queen Victoria took a look at it, declared that she liked it, and then everyone in London high society had to have one.
Wow.
So companies popped up producing stereoscopes and sending out photographers to produce material for them. Here in the U.S., an inexpensive stereoscope was designed by a guy named Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. He was a poet, physician, inventor, and the father of a noted Supreme Court justice. And you've probably seen the Holmes-style stereoscopes. These are the ones that just look like a wood bar with a hood on the front. You put a card in the back, and you can slide it to focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually seen those, yeah.
He chose not to enforce a patent on that. So he actually open sourced it, and anyone could make one. Throughout the Civil War, photographers went all over the country documenting the war in 3D. So many of the Civil War photos that you see published are one half of a pair.
Wow.
And stereoscopes, because they were inexpensive, available just about everywhere, became sort of the home entertainment system of the latter part of the 19th century. People didn't leave their hometowns, so you could go down to your general store and get a stereoscope and the latest set of cards and visit the Egyptian pyramids or the gold mines of the Klondike and see all these places that you'd never actually be able to travel to. In some ways, what they were doing then was sort of the analog version of what VR does now.
Yeah.
Transporting you to another place where you actually feel like you're there. And so there were experiments in creating cinematic 3D as early as the turn of the century. And actually the first 3D that was shown in a theater to an audience was in 1915.
Wow.
It was an experiment.
So early.
Yeah. It was done at the Astor Theater in New York. The footage that was shown there doesn't exist anymore, so we don't actually know what it looked like. But that's the first documented showing of a 3D movie in a theater. And the first 3D feature film came out around 1923. It was a silent movie called The Power of Love, which is also a lost silent film. But there were quite a few 3D shorts and even a couple more features in the 1920s. There was a musical science fiction film called Mars. I mean, musical in that it was silent, but it had music playing with it. I think it was also sort of a comedy. I believe one side of that movie may survive, but the 3D version doesn't. There were a series of short films done in the mid-1920s called plastograms. There were, in the 1930s, there were several short films. MGM had a producer on staff named Pete Smith, who did these sort of, kind of screwball comedies, these shorts. And MGM purchased a bunch of 3D test footage, handed it over to Pete Smith and said, make a short film out of it. So he wrote this silly narration about how 3D pops off the screen and made this film called Audioscopics that actually got an Oscar nomination in the 1936 Oscars in a category that doesn't exist anymore. It was a best novelty short.
Oh wow!
But it did well enough that Smith did a sequel for it in 1938 called New Audioscopics, and a third in the series. They shot original material in 1941 for a short film called Third Dimensional Murder.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Like
It's a fun one, and that one actually does survive. You can hunt that one down, and we've even got a 35 millimeter print of that at the museum.
Wow, cool.
But that one was interesting. It was it's a comedy, but it's all about what can we poke the audience with, and and MGM did a parody of Frankenstein's monster and pretty much ripped off the Jack Pierce makeup for their version of it. So that's a fun little film. In 1939, there was a big breakthrough in 3D presentation. The Polaroid company introduced polarizing filters. And at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, they showed the first publicly shown polarized 3D projection. What this means is that they actually had two projectors running. And I should say, to make a 3D movie, you've actually got to shoot two movies. Mm-hmm. You're shooting a whole movie from a left eye perspective and a whole movie from the right eye perspective. And in order for an audience to see the movie in 3D, they have to see the left version in their left eye and the right version in their right eye. So you need some method of filtering the image on the screen so that each eye only sees the correct version of the movie. Prior to 1939, they used what was called anaglyph, and that's the red and blue glasses or the red and green glasses that people usually associate with a 3D movie.
Right.
In 1939, they introduced polarized projection. And what they did for this, they actually had two projectors running simultaneously in the projection booth with a synchronizer that made the motors run in perfect sync. One projector ran a print of the left eye version of the movie, the other ran the right eye. And they were both projecting on screen at the same time. So if you just looked at the screen without any kind of glasses on, you'd see a double image. They put polarizing filters in front of each projection lens. And what the polarizing filters do, you can kind of think of them as sort of a microscopic comb. It only lets light pass through where the waves of light match the angle of the polarizer. So if you put a polarizer in front of one lens at a 45 degree angle, all the light that passes through the waves are at 45 degrees. Yeah. If you put a filter on the other projector at 135 degrees, it's the exact opposite of the 45 degree filter. So those light waves are at a 135 degree angle. You project that onto a silver metallic screen so that the image on screen stays polarized. And if you put the same angle filters over your eyes, your left eye only sees the light from the left projector, and your right eye only sees the light from the right projector. And you're able to filter the two images on screen so that your brain fuses them together and you get the depth from all the differences. So this was shown at the Chrysler Pavilion. There was a film, stop motion animation of a Chrysler car assembling itself.
Wow, that's cool.
It was a big hit, and this method of polarized projection became the standard for how 3D would be shown. in the early 1950s, there were these brothers, Milton and Julian Gunsberg, and Milton was a screenwriter. Julian was an ophthalmologist, and they were both fans of 3D photography and had this idea that they could design a custom-built camera system to shoot 3D movies. And they hired a couple camera engineers. They built this contraption that would have two 35mm cameras pointed lens to lens into a pair of mirrors, kind of like what Wheatstone had done with his viewer 100 years earlier.
Wow.
And they pitched this around to all the studios, and there was limited interest. And an independent filmmaker, Arch Obler, who was probably best known for his science fiction and suspense radio series, he was going into production on an independent film about the lions that were attacking the colonials trying to build a train through northern Africa.
Yeah. It goes in the darkness later.
Yeah.
I was about to say.
It's that story. It's that story. But he was making this film in 1952 and saw a demonstration of this 3D system that the Gunsbergs were calling natural vision, and thought, this is actually what I need to make this picture unique. So he got the backing to shoot the picture using natural vision. It was released, the title was Blonde Devil, came out around Thanksgiving of 1952, and opened in two theaters in Los Angeles to sold-out crowds. There were lines around the block. And the studios took notice. Over at Warner Brothers, Jack Warner said, whatever they're doing, I want it. Mm-hmm. So Warner Brothers hired the natural vision system. They put a rushed production into the studio House of Wax with Vincent Price.
Yes.
And at the same time, Columbia put their own camera system together, started up on a picture called Man in the Dark. Warner Brothers wanted to be the first studio to have a 3D feature film. Columbia beat them by just a couple of days with Man in the Dark. Man in the Dark was black and white. House of Wax was Warner color. So Warner Brothers revised all their marketing to say the first color studio picture in 3 dimensions. But that pretty much launched this craze for 3D in the beginning of 1953. And just about every studio jumped on the bandwagon, making their own 3D pictures. Between the end of 1952 and 1955 would have been the last 3D release of that wave, there were 50 Hollywood 3D movies.
Wow.
Wow, holy crap.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Wow, that's quite the rush.
And they covered the entire range of A movies, B movies. There were a lot of Westerns.
Yeah, like, was it Fort Apache? Or like, I remember there were a lot of...
Fort Ty.
Fort Ty.
Charge at Feather River.
Yeah.
John Wayne's Hondo was filmed in 3D.
Oh, wow.
There were costume dramas. There were musicals. The Cole Porter musical Kiss Me Kate was filmed in 3D, and it's actually fantastic if you get to see it that way.
Oh, wow.
Choreography in 3D on stage is just such a great subject for a 3D movie.
Yeah, I can imagine.
People tend to think of 3D as sort of being, low-grade monster movies. And there were some. You had Catwomen of the Moon and one of my favorites, Robot Monster.
Yeah.
But you also had some big budget studio science fiction and monster movies. It Came from Outer Space at Universal was based on a Ray Bradbury story. It's a great movie. Mm-hmm. The last of the Universal classic monsters, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, was filmed in 3D, as was the sequel, 1954's Revenge of the Creature, which I think was much more the basis for Guillermo del Toro's Shape of Water, because it was all about capturing the creature and taking him to a research facility.
Yeah.
All of these movies were shown using polarized projection. There's this misconception that the red and blue glasses were used for 3D movies. And in the 1950s, red and blue glasses were used for comic books, but they weren't used for the movies. Right. The movies all used polarized glasses, which are very, very similar to what you'd get if you go to see a 3D movie in a Real D theater today.
Do you think that's just like sort of a pop culture marketing thing now? Because now we see these quote unquote retro images of 50s people in a theater with red and blue glasses. Do you think that's just because it looks cool? Like it's like
I think there's a couple factors. One, it's a lot easier to associate glasses that have red and blue filters with being 3D
as opposed to clear lenses.
As opposed to what just looks like sunglasses.
With normal glasses.
Yeah. Now, at some point, there's a famous photo of an audience watching Guana Devil. It was published in Life magazine, and it was a black and white photo. At some point, somebody in the 1970s colorized it and put red and blue on all the glasses.
There we go.
So we think about it that way. The 3D comic book craze also happened in 1953. It was also very brief. It only lasted through the summer of 53 and a little bit into the fall. But in order to have two images on a printed page, they had to use colors.
Yeah.
So for every 3D comic book, you got a pair of red and blue glasses. So there's a lot of pictures of kids wearing those glasses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so we associate that as, those are 3D glasses. And then some of the 1950s 3D movies got re-releases in the 1970s. And at that point, theaters weren't equipped to show polarized 3D. So the re-releases were done in anaglyph.
Oh,
and so people from our generation who saw 3D movies in a theater in our childhood are going to remember the red and blue glasses.
Right. The first time I saw Creature from the Black Lagoon in a theater in 3D was anaglyph. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's how it was on VHS as well. My dad, there was only like a couple of movies that were actually 3D that he had in his video store, and Creature from the Black Lagoon was one of them. And he had like a stack of 3D glasses that he would sit out with it, and they were the red and blue. It didn't look great.
No, it didn't. And well, you might also remember in the early 80s, there were a number of attempts to show some of these classic 3D movies on TV, where you could,
late
go to your 7-Eleven, get a pair of glasses, and they'd have Elvira introduce the movie, and you'd watch Revenge of the Creature. And so one of the problems there was, we were watching on NTSC TVs, and there's this sort of inside joke among video engineers that NTSC means never the same color.
I know that joke.
Because, NTSC TVs, these old tube TVs, use phosphors to create colors on the screen. And they never matched what they were supposed to be.
Right.
You could play with the color and tint knob, but you were never going to get it to look the way it was going to look on a studio monitor.
Yeah.
And so you were never going to get it to actually match the filters in the glasses. What would happen is you'd end up with crosstalk, where the left eye would see part of the right image and the right eye would see part of the left image, and you get these awful double images. So you'd see sort of a 3D effect, but you'd also see all this ghosting. So those early 3D TV broadcasts, if you ever get to watch them on a studio monitor, they look great, but at home they weren't so good. And in fact, 3D presentation in the 50s had its flaws. Because you had to have two projectors running in perfect sync, you needed, skilled projectionists, two of them in the booth. And if the left film had a break, you'd have to find the same frames in the right film and cut those out to match them up, or you'd end up out of sync. You had to make sure that the projectors were aligned so that they were projecting properly on the screen. We converge our eyes. We can look in the distance parallel, and we can look at something close with our eyes turned in. But our eyes don't look up and down at the same time. So if you were vertically out of alignment on your screen, you'd cause a lot of eye strain for your audience.
Yeah.
If one projector was brighter than the other, you'd cause eye strain for your audience. And by the end of 1953, the quality control at theaters wasn't really all that great. Movies would look good for the first few days, and then they'd be out of alignment, they'd be out of sync. It was very expensive for the studios to produce and distribute 3D.
Yeah.
required twice as much film.
Mm-hmm.
It meant that they would have to ship twice as many prints to theaters to show it. And the theaters would have to pay 2 union projectionists to operate it. So at the same time, one of the studios, 20th Century Fox, was heavily invested in CinemaScope, which they kind of pushed as 3D without the glasses. And it wasn't 3D, it was just a wide screen.
Yeah.
But it only required 1 film print and an anamorphic lens, and was considerably less expensive to distribute a movie that way. So
lives on today.
Yeah, as there were a number of releases that weren't seeing the kind of box office results that the earlier pictures had, the studios started halting production of future 3D movies. The ones that were filmed in the later part of 1953 came out in 1954. But by the end of 1954, nobody was making 3D anymore. And the last of the 1950s 3D wave was Revenge of the Creature that came out in 55. There were some attempts to revive 3D. There was The Mask in 1961. It was the first Canadian-produced 3D horror film. And it only had several sequences in 3D.
Yeah, whenever you put on the mask.
Put the mask on now. The audience would put on their magic mystic 3D glasses and see these trippy scenes in the underworld.
Which are fantastic.
They're amazing. They're
it's
so
a
weird.
Great movie. And that one was shown in theaters using anaglyph glasses, because by 1961, theaters weren't showing 3D polarized anymore. There was a brief comeback in the early 70s. Arch Oboler actually made a 3D movie called The Bubble that got a release. It was roadshowed around the country to be shown properly in 3D, and then got a re-release under another title. There was an exploitation movie called The Stewardesses that for a long time was the most profitable 3D movie ever made.
I'm sure it was.
And it was, I probably don't need to explain what the plot there was, because it didn't have much of one. And then, through the 70s, there were quite a few exploitation movies that were made in 3D, various sex films and martial arts films, things that were playing, college campuses and midnight shows. And then we get to the 1980s. And I know we're going to talk about 1983 in detail, but there was a movie that came out in 1981 that kind of kicked off the whole 1980s craze. That was called Comin' at Ya.
Yes.
It's a crazy movie. If you ever have a chance to see it in 3D, I mean, it's eye-wrenching 3D. It's extreme 3D. And they titled it Comin' at Ya because they are literally throwing everything they can at the audience. But it was able to play in theaters because a system was devised where they could have a 3D movie on a single print of film.
Oh.
What they'd actually do, because at this point, everything was widescreen. So within one full 35 millimeter frame, they would put both the left and right images, one stacked right on top of the other.
Oh, wow.
Oh, interesting.
And then there'd be a special lens or a mirror box that would get mounted on the front of the projector that would split the top and bottom and project them both in the same place on the screen. And that would have polarizers in it, so they could do polarized 3D from a single strip of film. So that's pretty much that's why there was a revival in the 80s, because the single strip technology was able to allow any theater that had a silver screen to show 3D without having all the complexities of having 2 projectors.
Fascinating.
The other drawback of having to have 2 projectors running simultaneously, and this is something I don't think people realize about 3D movies in the 50s. Normally, when you're showing a movie in a theater, it's broken up onto a bunch of reels. So you'd show reel 1, and then you'd change over to the other projector. Mm-hmm. Most theaters had 2 projectors, right, but they'd have them so that they could do reel 1, change over to reel 2, change over to reel 3, and go back and forth without having to have a break in the film. And we probably all remember as kids watching a movie and seeing that circle in the top right corner.
Yeah.
And that was actually the mark that would tell the projectionist you have 10 seconds till change over. And then there'd be a second one, 5 seconds till change over. And then they'd throw the switch to go from projector 1 to projector 2. When you were running a 3D movie, you couldn't do changeovers because both projectors were running, one with the left, one with the right. So they actually had to have intermissions in 3D movies.
Oh.
Oh.
Like multiple intermissions, like
no. What they would do is
reels.
Bigger reels. They would put as much of the movie as they could. They could fit close to an hour onto like a 4,000 or 6,000 foot reel.
Wow.
And they'd run that first half of the movie or first hour of the movie, and then they'd have to take a 10, 15-minute break while the projectionists take these massive reels off and switch it for the last part of the movie. I have a friend who was a projectionist in the 50s, and he said they actually had to cut a hole in the floor of the projection booth to fit the take-up reel.
Oh, wow.
Because these reels were so big.
Oh my
so like
gosh.
like a slit so that the...
Yeah. So the reel could turn in the floor. Yeah. It was either that or they'd have to raise the projector and cut new port windows.
Right.
Yeah.
For the clearance.
And actually, by interesting coincidence, this friend of mine was the stereoscopic expert on the movie Metalstorm. So we'll get to talking about him a little bit later.
Nice.
People often wonder, why does House of Wax right in the middle have this odd scene with a guy with a paddle ball breaking the fourth wall talking to the audience? And the fact of the matter is, that scene came right after the intermission. So that scene is playing as the audience is coming back to their seats.
Oh,
so he breaks the fourth wall and he's saying, "I'm going to knock that popcorn right out of your lap," as he paddle balls at them.
Yeah.
And it was to draw the audience back into the movie. And there's a line where Vincent Price is giving a tour of the museum, and his investor says, or he says to his investor, I hope you don't think that hoopla outside is too much. Eventually, we won't need that. And he's actually talking about having to have this scene just for 3D's sake, to draw the audience back in. But all of the movies in the 50s had these intermissions. And then by the 80s, going with single strip, they didn't need to do that anymore.
Wow. Fascinating. That's so interesting. I always thought it was 1983, like the 3D craze that happened, that little brief one, was because it was 1983. And that's why there were more 3D, but it really sounds like it was this technological breakthrough that really just led to it.
Yeah, that brought it back. And like I said, coming at you in 1981. And then there were a few 3D releases in 1982.
Like Parasite and Friday the 13th Part
Parasite,
3.
Friday the 13th Part 3. And actually, I suppose the other thing that sort of spawned this 80s 3D craze was that there were several horror franchises that were up to the third movie in the series. Yeah. And it was kind of a no-brainer that if you're making Friday the 13th Part 3 and they're pushing this new 3D technology, let's do it in 3D.
Yeah.
And then if you're making Jaws, Amityville 3, Jaws 3. Yeah. So you had all of these threes that just kind of lended themselves to having the 3D added to it. And now, I mentioned that there were all kinds of 3D movies in the 50s. They had a scene here or there where they'd have that paddleball kind of gimmick thing. But overall, they were using the 3D to create a sense of space. And it was a lot like the 3D photography that had come before it. The 80s, however, was all about 3D as a gimmick. And most of the 3D movies made in the 80s were these B-schlock movies. Mm-hmm. I kind of get a kick out of the fact that 3 of the movies in the 80s wave, which actually it began in 81 and we can say it ended in 85.
Sure.
Although there were a couple things that came after that. But 3 of the pictures have these long, convoluted titles, too.
Oh, yes.
Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, Metalstorm, The Destruction of Jared-Syn.
Yeah. And Star Chaser or...
the Star Chaser, The Legend of Orin.
Yeah. Which we are actually going to discuss that film as well when we get to our sort of not safe for kid animation movies and stuff.
Okay.
That'll be how we're ending the year with animation.
But that's sort of, the run-up to 1980s 3D. And 3D kind of comes in these waves. So it went away in the 80s, but every time there's a sort of a technological advancement in 3D, it makes a comeback.
Yeah.
So it was we had 3D movies in the 1920s and 30s. Polarized projection led to this 3D fad of the 1950s. Single strip polarized projection led to its revival in the 80s. And it was digital projection that brought it back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would you also say, because there was also a way we could now post-convert films that were not shot in 3D, we could now turn those into 3D through a post-conversion process. So was that part of the Ox revival as well?
It has been. It didn't start out that way. Well, actually, I suppose it kind of did. You had some early attempts at digital 3D with like Robert Rodriguez doing Spy Kids 3D and Shark Boy and Lava Girl. Theaters weren't equipped for 3D at that point, so those were actually shown using anaglyph glasses.
Yeah, I saw Spy Kids 3D.
I think we saw that together.
We did see that together. Yeah. And it looked pretty good. It was migraine inducing, but it looked pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. And then sort of 2006, that there was a big push for theaters to switch from film to digital projection, and Disney helped subsidize this. In fact, all the studios helped subsidize getting these new projectors into theaters. And part of it was that with digital projection, 3D wasn't a complicated thing to do. The projectors could do it. You just needed an electronic polarizer and a silver screen. In order to encourage theaters to make the switch, Disney made an animated feature, Chicken Little, in 3D. And computer graphics, it was relatively uncomplicated to be able to render a left view and then have a different virtual camera and render a right view. And that kind of launched the modern 3D wave. There was a conversion that was done at the time. They went back and redid Polar Express for 3D. But again, that was a computer animated film.
Yeah.
So they were able to do a lot of that with re-rendering.
And then Avatar, of course, in 2009, just blew.
Oh yeah,
blew
there
a
were
hole through everything.
there were a number of new camera systems that came out as well to shoot digital 3D using a pair of cameras on a big rig with mirrors.
Yeah.
And so quite a few live action films went into production that way. And a few companies popped up that were offering conversion services. The early conversions were terrible. Like if you ever have the misfortune of seeing the 3D Clash of the Titans remake, it is just awful.
I had the misfortune of seeing the 2D Clash of the Titans remake.
The movie wasn't that good to begin with, and then they rushed a 3D process through. But as the conversion technology got better and better, and it is a really, really labor-intensive process.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Essentially, if you're converting a 2D movie to 3D, every shot of the movie is now an effect shot. It has to go to an effects house that specializes in this kind of work, where they go through frame by frame and do rotoscoping of everything in the frame.
Oh my gosh!
It all gets separated out into individual elements, and then there's several different techniques. You can shift things around. You can create depth maps that give things volume. But there are all these hands-on techniques that you need artists to do to convert it and have it look correct. And actually, the latest thing now is there are AI systems that are being taught how to do 3D conversion.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And they're marginally okay.
Certainly, it's going to be probably a lot cheaper to do it that way. And
it is, but there are a lot of things that they get wrong. Yeah. So you still need to have humans who go through and tweak everything to make it look right.
Right.
But yeah, these days, there's actually very little that's being shot natively in 3D. Most of the 3D movies that come out these days are either an animated movie or a live action movie that's been post-converted. And when I say a live action movie, I'm talking like a Marvel movie where 70% of what you're seeing on the screen has been composited there anyway.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's borderline animation.
Right.
Yeah. So as long as everything is an effect shot already, it makes more sense for that kind of movie to convert everything afterwards.
Amazing. Well, that is an excellent primer and a vast history of 3D cinema up until today. Eric, can you talk a little bit about 3D space here in LA? If someone was to visit, what kind of exhibits could they see that are currently on display or, constantly on display at your space?
Sure. Yeah. Well, 3D Space is a small museum. Actually started as a nonprofit organization in 2014. There were several 3D historians. Earlier, I'd mentioned Ray Zone. And there was another 3D historian named Dan Sims. Dan passed away in 2011, and he had a pretty large collection of 3D material of historical significance. Ray and I were able to rescue a lot of items from his collection. And then about a year later, sadly, we lost Ray, and I had to talk to his family and rescue a lot of his collection. So in 2014, I started 3D Space as a nonprofit to sort of preserve these collections and eventually to provide a public space where people could learn about it. And I was doing pop-up exhibits and 3D movie screenings anywhere people would let me do them. In 2018, I was able to get this odd little basement space in Echo Park. I actually made a perfect gallery space for one person to operate. And I've got the whole museum collection. We've got, I would say some 90,000 items in the collection.
Wow.
That are all stored in another space in the same building. So I'm able to curate exhibits and move things into this gallery space in this quirky little sort of hidden basement that you have to know about to find.
It's by appointment only, folks, if you want to visit the 3D space.
Yes, it's by appointment, but that's partially out of necessity because I give a personalized tour. So I can only be open at times when I can actually be there to do it. The current exhibit is the 5th exhibit that I've had in the space since it opened in 2018. And it's sort of an overview of the whole history of 3D. Everything from starting with Wheatstone and Brewster, and then stereo viewers of the early 20th century, 3D movies and comic books, Viewmasters, and all the way up to the latest digital displays, glasses-free electronic screens. We've actually got some really interesting 1970s era holograms. And I like to say if you see it in 3D, like if you see depth in it with 2 eyes, it's in our collection, and at some point it's going to be on display.
That's amazing. Well, folks, you've got to check out 3D Space if you ever visit LA or if you live here. That was a wealth of knowledge, Eric. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you know about 3D. You are a bastion of knowledge on this subject.
I've put in my 10,000 hours on it.
You have. You just know this stuff off the top of your head. It's amazing. All right, folks. Well, let's get into the very first 3D film we're talking about this month. We're going to talk about Spacehunter, The Adventures in the Forbidden Zone.
Hold on to your seat. Hold on to your date. Hold on to your popcorn. The ultimate 3D movie is about to blast off. Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. The first 3D space movie, starring Peter Strauss as Wolf, an intergalactic adventurer, and Molly Ringwald as Nikki.
What the hell are you?
What do you think I am, you scrawny earthbag? I'm a woman!
Together, they must enter the deadly Forbidden Zone and rescue 3 beautiful women from the planet's ultimate evil, the Overdog.
I like her. Works every time.
I'll bet breeding with us would kill him.
I'll take that bet.
Columbia Pictures presents an adventure unlike anything you've ever witnessed before. A whole new dimension in excitement. The ultimate 3D experience. The first movie that puts you in outer space. Spacehunter. Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. In 3D.
All right. Gray, can you synopsize Spacehunter for our listeners out there?
Yeah, so Spacehunter starts with like this 1%er space liner getting blown up and fritzing out, and like these 3 super hot Earth women escape from it in like a luxury kind of escape pod. And as the escape pod jettisons away, a pre-recorded voice tells them, "Don't worry, you are being transported to the nearest planet that matches your environmental and cultural needs," or something like that. But, you know, then it like crashes on a horrible desert planet where like Mad Max marauders immediately kidnap him and take him away and everything's awful. It's great. It's kind of like it predicted how dumb self-driving cars and like tech pro corporations are now. Yeah, it's kind of funny. But then an intergalactic sort of trash man / bounty hunter named Wolf, who's played by a pretty great Peter Strauss, intercepts the distress signal from the escape pod and realizes he can score a lot of money if he rescues these Earth women. This leads him to the desert planet where he inadvertently teams up with a scrappy scavenger named Nikki, who's played by 14 or, 15-year-old Molly Ringwald, and a pitch-perfect Ernie Hudson as a righteous soldier named Washington. And they all team up to take on everything from these fat, maggoty mutants oozing out of slime sacks to sexy cyber sirens and techno swamps, all the way ultimately to Michael Ironside as this weird, bald, androgynous robot nightmare who sucks the essence from slave girls and makes people run through like the deadliest version of Nickelodeon's Double Dare that like you've ever seen. And this movie is somehow rated PG. It is weird, and it's Spacehunter.
Now, Eric, obviously you've seen all of these films. What did you think of Spacehunter, and what is your relationship with this film?
You know, Spacehunter is actually a fun movie.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Peter Strauss is really good in it.
He's great.
Yeah. And Ernie Hudson is also great in this movie.
Yeah.
And, you know, the screen debut for Molly Ringwald?
Is it her debut? When did Tempest come out?
Oh, actually, you're right. I thought the
Mazursky film.
Yeah, it came out just before. You know, okay, she's a little annoying in the movie. But I think that's, you know, the character's
that's
written.
The intent.
The character's written to be that way. Yeah. And actually, and Michael Ironside as Overdog.
Oh, yeah.
Is just such a great villain. Well, anything Michael Ironside does is great.
Totally.
Oh, yeah.
You know, as these Road Warrior post-apocalyptic vehicle movies go, you know, this is a fun one. You know, it's got some elements from Star Wars. It's got some elements from the Mad Max movies. And Michael Ironside in this big crane arm sending people through a machinery that's going to chew them up. You know, it's great stuff. If anything, one of the weak things in it is the 3D. Wasn't the best filmed 3D movie. So there's a number of misaligned shots that are kind of baked into how they filmed it. It just wasn't quite set right. There were problems in the shooting, and because they were filming it, you know, you don't get to adjust the 3D afterwards. If you haven't done it right on the set,
right,
those things get baked into it. There's some great miniature photography.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
You know, I'm a sucker for movies where, you know, people are driving these hacked together vehicles and
same
shooting lasers at each other. So yeah, I enjoy it. I wish there was a way to see it in 3D.
Yes.
It hasn't been fully digitally restored for 3D. There was a Blu-ray release from Mill Creek Entertainment a couple of years ago that I think is out of print now, but they only released it in 2D. And I'm not sure that we're ever going to get a proper 3D release of it. Hopefully someday someone will. The only way to potentially see it in 3D, there are some bootlegs floating around.
Oh, okay. Great. I think you said on one of our shows that this was the very first 3D film you saw in the theater. What did you think of Spacehunter?
Indeed, man. And scenes, this all just came rushing back to me. This is the first time I've seen this movie since I was 7 years old and saw it in the theater when my parents took me to see it in 3D. It's the first 3D movie I ever saw. So this was a lot. So this was just like all of these memories, and so I had a fucking blast. It was just like this id moment, and it was like this fun, adventurous kids movie mixed with like this really weird, kinky, perverse movie at the same time. And I'm like, oh, holy crap, this is like me. This is like sort of me distilled down to like this fun, innocent guy who's also like weird. I'm like, this made me who I am. It's all Spacehunter.
Take this to your shrink. I made a breakthrough.
Yeah, and like Michael Ironside, like I distinctly, I think I even mentioned when we were first talking about the 3D episode that I remembered there being this weird, scary, sexy space witch. I'm like, that's fucking Michael Ironside. That's how I remembered it but because he's so weirdly androgynous and like bald and like he's so alien and strange that in my 7-year-old brain I thought he was a witch and with robot arms, this weird robot witch.
I think he was sort of the inspiration for the Borg Queen in First Contact and like
I can see that.
Sense.
Yeah.
So I swear, like, I think maybe your brain might have also switched them around just because there's so much similarity between the two. I will
buy that. Yeah. It's just, I really just had such a good time with this movie, revisiting it. And like I said, these little things came back at me. I distinctly remembered the pudgy, like, maggot people coming out of the mucousy sacs. Oh, that had stuck with me. And the minute I saw it happening, I was like, oh shit, right, God, that terrified me. And it was great because AE were calling them like an army of Henriettas from the basement from Evil Dead 2. And I'm like, oh yeah, they kind of are.
Yes.
There's like all this
very much great... so. Yeah, army of Henriettas.
And you know, this movie almost gives Charlie Band and Metalstorm, because I always call Charles Band the master of like whatever's trending at the time mashups, you know? He's like the king of mashing up whatever's trendy at the moment. This one almost gives that one a run for its money, because this is like Star Wars, Mad Max, there's elements of Indiana Jones. It just and it does it all in such a fun way.
Well, and it's an Ivan Reitman movie.
It is, yes, yeah.
Produced by Ivan Reitman. Yeah,
100%.
I love that he went from like Stripes and Meatballs to this.
Yeah,
and then
I know.
did Ghostbusters after this. And you can completely see the DNA of so much of what came into Ghostbusters from this. I mean, Ernie Hudson was not a particularly known property, and I'm almost sure this is how Ernie Hudson ended up in Ghostbusters, was his work with Reitman on this film.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, this movie's like 100% a movie about the production design and the effects and, like, what action they could afford and sort of opportunistic genre bending based on popular trends, like I said. You know, it's not so much about story or super-duper character development, but that said, like Eric was saying, Peter Strauss and Ernie Hudson and Ironside and even Molly Ringwald, she was freaking great. There's also some really funny, goofy dialogue moments, like when Molly Ringwald sees the Earth Girl slaves in the cage for the first time. Her line where she's like, well, their outfit's okay, but they're not so hot. I was like, it's really funny. And then when like the guard catches Ernie Hudson like setting the bomb, and he's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm planning a bomb. What's it look like? Like, there's like really great,
very witty. Yeah,
it's just got
witty dialogue for sure.
Well, and here's a little Easter egg for you. There's at the beginning of the movie, there's a voice over the comm system in the spaceship.
Harold Ramis.
It's Harold Ramis.
No shit.
I recognized it immediately. Yeah.
Oh wow.
No he has such a distinct voice. I was like, that's Harold Ramis. I looked it up on IMDb. I was like, yep, that's Harold Ramis.
And like Eric was also saying, the design, just the sort of kit-bashed spaceships and the, you know, I am a sucker for that. And the cars, everything just looked great. The pirate ship train car, oh man.
Yeah. That barge, the pirate barge. Yeah, that was so cool.
I loved this one. I really did. I had a great, and particularly I want to make an escape room like in my yard out of Overdog's
the maze,
like,
Overdog's
I really do.
maze of hell.
Yeah,
flame throwing grinders.
Yes, for sure. This was such a pleasant rewatch. I had not seen this since I was a kid. I hadn't seen it since probably the year it came out on video in my dad's video store. This wasn't even one I think I watched maybe more than once. I can't remember, but I'm surprised at how great this is and how well this is held up. It's got such a great pace to it. It literally just throws you right into it. This space cruise ship explodes. These three models essentially like crash land on this planet. They're taken in by these, marauders and stuff. And then it just gets right into it. The bounty hunter, he's heading there. You're like, oh, he's got this like, girlfriend and stuff flying with him, and then of course it turns out after the big shootout on the barge train, nope, she's a robot.
She's a robot.
She's a slash mechanic sex bot and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's too bad they kill her so early in the movie too.
I know, she was great. Like, for the very little screen time she had, she was fantastic. You know, we had to make room for the Molly Ringwald, sort of relationship, which was not a sexual relationship. It was more like a father-daughter relationship, thank God. So
I know, I kept waiting. I was like, no, this is a PG movie.
Please don't.
Surely it's
I was like, no kiss at the end, and thank God. But Peter Strauss, he's not someone often think about, but he is great in this. He is such a good Han Solo, grimy kind of bounty hunter. And the chemistry between him, Ringwald, and Ernie Hudson is just fantastic. And, this really has that classic kind of Western, we've got to go get the bounty, we got to go save these girls, that kind of thing. That's totally what this feels like, because this is just moving from one set piece after the other. Gray, you'd mentioned the crazy tower with the like obese monsters coming after them. That was fantastic. There's like the sea nymphs, like where they go underwater into that
them.
water. That was so good.
Cyber sirens. Yeah, I wish there was more of that.
I wouldn't even have understood like the sexual connotations going on in this scene at an early age.
And the environment they lived in was like a trashy cyber Dagobah system. Like it looked like
it was like a little tunnel swamp,
like a plumber's version of the Dagobah system. Yeah, it was really cool.
That's the thing. I mean, the production design, it looks so kind of like, you see all this stuff, you're like, is that bubble wrap? Like stuff like in the background, but it has a charm to it. Like this sort of thrown together, like post-apocalyptic looking sci-fi world that they created. I think it was kind of ridiculed by critics when it came out, but now in hindsight, I'm like loving it. It's just, there's so much to look at, and there's so many different ideas and stuff going on in the art direction. I think it's really fantastic.
Well, and they put their money, you can see where they put their money in the right place. Like, the vehicles, the
vehicles are fantastic. Yeah.
Awesome stuff with Michael Ironside's Fortress. And then you can see where it's like, well, we didn't have enough money. Like the chemist, which of course he's German. You have to have your mad scientist character who has a German accent. But like the chemist's lab is straight out of MST3K. It's like, it's like, let's just make this. It looks like a public access TV set.
Overdog. Wow. What a design. God. I mean, what a cool looking villain, and just Michael Ironside, perfect casting. He is just chewing the scenery in every little moment.
He's got that voice.
He's just creepy. I mean, Michael Ironside, he's probably, you're never going to see a movie where he's like a dad, like a friendly coach or something of a football team. I mean, he's just, he's going to blow up someone's head. So with his brain, I mean, that's what's going to happen here. I also found that there's kind of an interesting 6 degrees with this film, because obviously we discussed Meatballs, which is, Ivan Reitman's first directed film. And then we also, 2 of the screenwriters worked on The Vindicator. The terrible, awful Vindicator that none of us liked. But they also worked on, were screenwriters on this film as well.
Oh my God.
So somehow magically, because this film, I mean, from a screenplay standpoint, it actually really works, I thought. I like the dialogue. I like the pacing. I liked the structure of everything. It really just went from one kind of memorable set piece after another. And then you've got this nice tight 90 minutes and it's done. And you're just like, oh, that was over like that. That was fantastic.
Well, I've often wondered, in 1981, Ivan Reitman had produced Heavy Metal.
Yes.
So there does seem to maybe be a through line from what they were doing with Heavy Metal going into Spacehunter.
Oh, certainly. There's
100%. Yes. Yeah.
Particularly the slave girls and like Michael Ironside, undress her. That could be out of a Heavy Metal comic.
It is like a live action Heavy Metal comic in a lot of ways.
Yes.
It really is. Even though it is also mirroring what was popular at the time with the popularity of the Road Warrior, had just come out, and of course Star Wars was the biggest thing ever at the time. So, and it is like a perfect kind of marriage of those two kind of films, the Wasteland Warrior type film, and yet also a sci-fi space opera Western in a way.
Yeah, about a year ago, I went to a play that starred Peter Strauss.
Oh, wow.
and had the opportunity
That's
to meet him after the show.
Wow.
And I told him how much I loved Spacehunter.
Ah!
And,
wow. What
and
was
he
his
was
reaction?
he was like, "You remember that movie?"
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't talk in depth about it, but I'm sure that's one that he doesn't hear very often.
Probably not. Probably not.
I'll
Yeah,
bet.
I don't. I mean, I think this, if I read this correctly, I think this came out the week before Return of the Jedi or something. Like, they specifically positioned it. Everybody's getting pumped about Return of the Jedi. Let's release a sci-fi kind of bounty hunter type film, and hopefully we'll get some audience attraction of that. I seem to remember seeing, like, a making of this film on TV, on like regular TV. So it had some backing behind it and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The big complaint I do recall from my childhood about this, you know, watching like Siskel and Ebert and stuff with my dad, was the 3D, like you'd mentioned. Like, they were complaining at the time, like the 3D wasn't that good in the film. Like, it didn't seem like they'd really even position things to like kind of come at you and all those kinds of things. It really seemed like more of an afterthought in this.
Well, and for what it's worth, Roger Ebert never liked 3D to begin with. So.
He didn't like a lot of things. He didn't like slasher films. He didn't like all kinds of stuff. So,
although he did give a glowing review to Evil Dead 2.
Well, we would have to fire him if he didn't.
Yeah.
This is hyper specific, but talking about just the production design and sort of the homey feel of a lot of this movie, Bob Burns is credited as one of the special effects contributors on this movie. So Bob and Kathy Burns are legendary in the world of sort of special effects. They're not special effects artists. They created the home haunt industry. They were from Burbank, California, and they literally built the first inviting children into their homes, and they would make their homes into haunted houses, and they got more and more. Rick Baker was a kid and would come into their homes. That's how he got into like special effects. It was Bob and Kathy Burns, and they literally created the haunted house industry as like starting off like making their home into a haunted house, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's how professional haunted houses started. And I noticed he's credited as an effects artist on this movie, and I was like, Bob Burns? Holy shit. And I tried to find more info, but I couldn't. It was just like he worked on this movie.
Bob is a good friend of mine.
I'm sure he is.
Yeah.
He's a hero of mine. I've never met him.
You know, we lost Kathy a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, no, Bob has had a really interesting life. You know, he has a massive collection of horror and sci-fi props and costumes.
Yes, that's what
that have been given to him through
like
the
a
years.
museum basically in his house.
Yeah, he's like the living 4A Ackerman at this point. Yeah.
And he actually has. I mean, his day job. He was like an editor at CBS, and he was also in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s one of Hollywood's preeminent gorilla men. He had a gorilla suit, and he had several different gorilla characters. Kogar was his mean gorilla. Tracy was his friendly gorilla. And if you remember the 1970s Filmation series, The Ghostbusters.
Yes, The Ghostbusters. He was the gorilla. Yes.
He was the gorilla in The Ghostbusters.
That's right.
But prior to that, I mean, going back to the 1950s, he and Kathy were working in special effects makeup. Mm-hmm. They started out doing spook shows at movie theaters and worked extensively with Paul Blaisdell, who did all those, cheap monsters for It Conquered the World. The She Creature and Invasion of the Saucermen and all of that. So Bob worked on all of those movies.
Yeah, there is I would encourage anyone to seek out and it's still out there. It's very available. Very charming documentary called Beast Wishes, which is about Bob and Kathy, and it's a very loving documentary.
And Bob and Kathy were also big fans of 3D. Their first date in 1953 was to see Charge at Feather River.
Oh.
And Bob tells a story of he had seen it already, so he knew the scene where Indians attack. So he snuck an arrow into the theater, and at that scene, he pulled out the arrow, thrust it into his chest, and said, "They got me." And apparently, people in the theater started screaming, and they stopped the movie, and the ushers came in because they thought someone had been injured.
Oh my gosh.
That's amazing.
And Bob said he hid the arrow and said, yeah, they ran out of here. I guess it worked because Kathy married him.
I was about to say at that point.
Yeah.
Like, This is the guy for me. Yeah.
This guy, he's a keeper.
And
Pull that off.
In 2003, there was the first of 3 3D expos at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, where they showed as many of the 1950s 3D movies as they could get thetheir hands on. They showed Charge at Feather River, and Bob and Kathy recreated their first date on its anniversary, and he brought the arrow and did the same thing. It was great. And they actually took quite a few 3D photos through the years of their monsters, their Halloween haunts, the collection.
Oh, wow.
I'm not sure if I still have it online, but I'm pretty sure if you go to the 3D Space YouTube channel, I've posted the video as a tribute when Kathy passed away of like a 25-minute slideshow of Bob and Kathy's 3D photography.
Wow.
Oh, if it is there, I will be finding it
definitely check
immediately.
that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's very interesting, Eric. Wow, so cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
All right, folks. So you can rent Spacehunter on VOD. There is an import Blu-ray available if you have a region-free player. And strangely enough, you can also stream it for free on YouTube. Well, from bounty hunters in space to a big old shark at SeaWorld, it's time for Jaws 3D.
A creature alive today has survived millions of years of evolution. It lives to kill, a mindless eating machine that will attack and devour anything. One terrified you like nothing you have ever experienced when it captured your imagination and tapped your fear like no movie before it. Then, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, 2 continued the legend and spread the fear. Next summer, nature's most terrifying creature takes on an all-new dimension in an all-new adventure. And for the first time, the terror of Jaws will not stop at the edge of the screen. 3D. The third dimension is terror.
Great. Can you synopsize Jaws 3D for our listeners out there?
Yeah, Jaws 3D is the third installment in the bafflingly unnecessary Jaws franchise. The only tenuous thread to the first 2 Jaws movies is that our main character is Mike Brody, the son of Chief Brody, played by Dennis Quaid. Mike now works as a sort of nebulous chief engineer role at SeaWorld Orlando with his girlfriend Kay Morgan, who is the park's marine biologist. Mike and Kay are hard at work to ensure a successful opening of SeaWorld's newest attraction, which is like this whole underwater world of tunnels where people can look at fish and stuff, and there's like a whole restaurant and lounge included with it too. And that's the brainchild of the park manager and entrepreneur Calvin Bouchard, played by Louis Gossett Jr. in a very suave and aloof manner. But this being a weird fish sequel movie, of course shenanigans ensue when a baby great white shark is trapped inside the park. And Calvin Bouchard makes a really bad decision to capture the baby shark and put it on display for the public. The baby shark ends up dying because it's been captured and it's a great white shark. And because of that, Mama Shark comes looking for some bloody revenge, of course. So now, of course, they have to figure out a way to kill the Mama Shark, because it's looking for bloody revenge, by any means necessary. And those means they get kind of downright goofy and nonsensical. What the studio did to Jaws 3 might be, in the words of screenwriter Richard Matheson, just stupid. But for better or worse, Jaws 3 has heroic dolphins, hillbilly water skiers, really weird 3D composite effects, and a gigantic, barely articulated shark coming at you very, very slowly in 3D. And that's Jaws 3.
That was a perfect synopsis for Jaws 3D. Excellent. All right. Well, Eric, obviously, you've seen Jaws 3D.
I have
quite a few times. What are some of your thoughts on Jaws 3D?
Oh, Jaws 3D is a flawed movie. in many, many ways. I'll give director Joe Alves credit. He was the art director on the original Jaws movie. He really tried, but there are just so many issues with this. I mean, I can focus on some visual effects problems. There was actually quite a bit of behind the scenes turmoil in the effects crew. Initially, a company was hired that was headed by a visual effects artist named Chuck Comiskey, alongside the Skotak brothers, the Oscar winners for their work on Aliens, among other movies. And they had a limited budget for visual effects and came up with this process where they were actually going to shoot the effects using video cameras on chroma key green screens. And then they'd be able to extract mats from that, transfer it to film, and composite it with the live action footage. And they did a number of tests, and they were working toward doing it this way. I've talked with Chuck, and I've talked with Denny and Bob Skotak about it. They said things were actually looking really, really good effects-wise. But the story, as I've heard it, is producers were looking for an out with these guys and ended up firing them, hiring a relative to come in, Hollywood nepotism, to redo the effects. The effects just never got finished. In fact, there's a shot in there where they're looking out through the glass just at green. They didn't even finish compositing in the underwater shot there. So there's quite a lot lacking in the effects. Now there's actually some good 3D. There's a really fun sequence where they're water skiing and the shark attacks, because it's set at this marine park where they have this show in the lagoon, and the shark gets in there and starts eating the water skiers who have done this big pyramid thing. And interesting side note, one of those water skiers is played by Leah Thompson before anybody knew who she was.
Yep. That's right.
Which actually, there's kind of a thread here. The three movies we're talking about, each one features an actress from the 80s who became a big thing in a later movie in the 80s. We had Molly Ringwald, this had Leah Thompson, and the next one, Kelly Preston.
That's right.
You mentioned the ending with the shark slowly coming through the glass. And I think that's what people tend to remember, that for the moments that are interesting, it's just not a good movie.
No.
Yeah. It's fun, though.
No.
Fun
and I'll say, if you have an opportunity to see it in 3D with an audience, that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those movies that you end up laughing inappropriately at.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's always better on a big screen with a crowd.
For sure.
You can rent this or get the Blu-ray and watch it at home, but you're not going to have the great experience you would when you see it with a full audience.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Gray, what did you think of Jaws 3D?
Well, same thing. What Eric just said, actually. Yeah, it would make... I can see seeing it as an adult with like a full audience in 3D. I did watch this in 3D, like I said earlier, but it was just with Jason and AE, which helped rather than just myself. So, again, I hadn't seen it since I was a 7-year-old kid. So it was interesting seeing this and Spacehunter for the first time since I was 7 in the theater. And what really caught me was the disparity between the visual and emotional impact of this movie had on me as like a goggle-eyed 7-year-old in the theater seeing a 3D movie between this and Spacehunter. Because like the memories and scenes that flooded back on me in Spacehunter was just huge and surreal. But with Jaws, I was like, when I saw it again, I was like, oh right, 3D severed leg. Oh right, shark like a big log breaking through a glass. Oh right, overly long shots slowly pushing in on fake coral and animatronic eels for a really long time. You know what I mean? Like,
Milk it
like
3D.
Like overt use of 3D for like, particularly the coral shot that's like 10 seconds long. It's like, why are we doing this? So,
well, it's got that opening sequence that
fish head, yeah.
with the fish head.
The fish head,
and
yes.
I guess a bloody fish head floating off the screen into your face it's an interesting effect.
Yeah, it looks great.
It looked great in 3D. I remember that in the theater.
Yeah.
But it's not the same as a skinny dipper getting eaten by a shark in the shadows.
No.
You know?
Correct.
Yeah.
And those, those overt things are what stuck with me. But then as an adult, I'm like, it's weird that this big Jaws sequel, that has the way more budget, is way more overt and less organic with its use of 3D than like Metalstorm or even Spacehunter. And I know I didn't see Spacehunter in 3D, so I don't know. I understand that the 3D apparently didn't work, but it was less, here I'm jabbing something in your face for no reason than like Jaws was. And then also, Jaws 3, it was kind of boring. Like, I mean, there was funny, and it didn't know what it was. Is it a disaster movie? Is it a comedy? Is it a shark movie? And it kind of failed at all three because it didn't know what it was doing. So I feel really bad for Richard Matheson and Carl Gottlieb because they're both like, this is not what we wrote. This is particularly Matheson. He's been pretty brutal about it.
Yeah.
And it's Richard Matheson, so I kind of believe what he has to say about it because I'm like, come on, it's Richard Matheson.
I think there's very little of what he wrote in this film. From my
But
understanding.
at the same time, there are three things that I absolutely love about this movie, and in order of appreciation, one is Louis Gossett Jr. as Calvin Bouchard, because he is so utterly suave and cool and collected. It feels like he's better than this movie.
Well, he always brings a certain gravitas to everything he's in. So.
He does, and he had just gotten off Officer and a Gentleman, so he's like, I feel like he, in this movie, knows he's better than this movie, and he doesn't need this movie. He's like, I don't need this role, and I know that. So it makes his role even better as Calvin, just being about. So I loved him. Cindy and Sandy, the heroic dolphins. That's all I need to say. But I also really loved the surreal and weirdly phantasmagoric 3D when it's combined with the composite effects. Like, not the normal just shooting 3D of a physical object, but when it's combined with the composite effects, it is so phantasmagorically strange. It's like something out of a bad dream, and I actually enjoyed it. Not because it's realistic, it was just so weird.
And Eric, maybe we can bounce off that. You seem to know quite a bit about the filmmaking process on this. Was like the jaws that came out at the end, like the teeth, the jawbones, is that like a digital effect or something?
No. They had a camera rig that was sort of a motion control thing, and they were able to shoot 3D on this motion control rig to have that effect.
It has such a strange look. It looks like bad CGI in a weird way.
But it was only 1983, so it predated anything digital. It's all opticals and miniatures.
Yeah, no. I mean, I knew they'd done a little bit of work on Star Trek II, like with the Genesis planet and stuff. But I was like, that's what I was thinking. I was like, this can't be 3D, like in terms of like a polygon type effect. Right. Yeah, but it has such a strange look to it. It's so bizarre.
It's particularly the combination of miniatures, like even the underground tunnels combined with the shark. When it's in 3D, it's just so... I can't even explain it. It's like something out of a dream. It's so weird. It's unlike anything when I saw it in 3D with my glasses, I was like, that is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. It's just not right, but it's unlike anything I've ever seen, and I don't know why.
Well, I think part of that is that the actual effect shots that they used were sort of hanky and unfinished.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
But again, I weirdly liked it. It's one of the things I liked about the movie. It's just so
like
unique.
a happy accident. So
it was unique in a movie that was not
the 3D.
Unique.
The 3D is well done.
That's what I remember about this film.
Yeah.
I'd seen 3D at home, like Gorilla at Large and stuff, which it didn't look great at home. So this was the first 3D movie, like proper 3D movie I ever saw, and wow, it blew my socks off. Actually, I mean even from the beginning, that fish head floating, it was just it was so vivid. It was just like right there in front of you. Gray, any other thoughts on Jaws?
I tell you what, the Neptune room is fucking swanky as hell. I would risk slowly drowning alive or a shark attack or even all the secondhand cigarette smoke that's probably in that club to have a drink with Louis Gossett Jr.
Yeah.
And watch stingrays and dolphins and stuff. The Neptune room, the design of that place, I was like, this is like, a late 70s, early 80s dream come true under the sea. I love that.
Totally. Yeah. It's so fascinating that they put this in SeaWorld because some of this seems to act like an ad for SeaWorld. Especially the last shot in the film, which is like the dolphins jumping up. And it's almost like how those buddy cop movies end with like a still and like they're high-fiving or something, but it's dolphins. And I was just like...
That is my favorite shot in the movie.
It really is pretty glorious, yeah. I mean, yeah, I was fascinated by this because it wasn't just Richard Matheson that like, you know, took a stab at this. It was also like the same screenwriter who wrote Dr. Detroit also took a stab at this. And like, you know, hey, whatever, man. Don't talk smack about Dr. Detroit, okay? I mean, I love me some Dr. Detroit. So, granted, I haven't seen it in 30 years, but I loved it as a kid. It's weird this movie was like totally panned when it came out, but it made still a ton of money and stuff. It was still riding high on the success of Jaws. And honestly, I rewatched Jaws 2 as well because I hadn't seen that for a good 30 years. And Jaws 2 it's a hard act to follow because Jaws is just one of the best fucking movies ever made. But Jaws 2 is a perfectly fine sequel.
Yeah, and if you're going to do a Jaws sequel, make it a slasher, you know?
It's
basically Jaws 2.
It's a competently made, well-paced, well-acted, well-done sequel. This thing is not. And, I mean, there are shots in this movie that are just out of focus. I don't know if you guys noticed that. There were several shots in the film that were just, people were just soft. And I was just like, how did this happen? Like, you know, with such a big professional Hollywood crew. I'm especially sad because this movie was originally going to be made by Joe Dante, and it was going to be called Jaws 3 People Zero. And
National Lampoon.
Yes, it was a National Lampoon's project. Spielberg, I guess, threatened to leave Universal. I've heard a couple of different stories on this, but what I heard from Joe Dante on another podcast was Spielberg threatened to leave Universal if they made it like that. And so, like...
Do you know how amazing that would have been? Especially as far back as 83, if they had made a Jaws spoof called Jaws 3, I would have been so down. I'd be down for that now. But, yeah... Wow. You
got to wonder, though, if Dante did it, would we have had Gremlins, you know, like, because those were kind of like back to back and stuff. So, I mean, who knows? But yeah, it's just one of those fascinating stories. It certainly would have been better than this.
Yeah.
That being said, I know we're talking a lot of smack about Jaws 3. I still had a great time watching this movie. It is like such a dumb, fun movie. You can just kind of turn your brain off and like just enjoy it for what it is. It is very entertaining. Dennis Quaid is notorious for saying he was on so much cocaine making this film that he doesn't even remember making this.
Can we just say for a moment, I've never entirely, casting-wise, I've never entirely understood how Mike Brody was able to age so much in 7 years.
Right.
I know.
They're never the same actors from film to film. The kids change in Jaws 2, this film, and they change in Jaws: The Revenge as well. So,
but it's only 7 years since the original.
Dennis Quaid is much older.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, what? It's like
he's a grown man who is running the engineering department at SeaWorld. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It makes very little sense. Also, and Eric, you could probably answer this. Is that harpoon at the screen? Is that the same 3D gag that like Friday the 13th Part 3 did like the year before? Because it seems like, isn't there a harpoon coming at the screen in that film?
Yeah. Jason shoots a spear into a girl's eye. Yeah.
There's so many little things in this movie I do really enjoy. I like the kind of like funhouse sort of world they go in when they're going into the undersea tunnels and stuff, like the tentacles on the wall and all that kind of stuff. That stuff is a lot of fun. And then, you know, Dennis Quaid's face when he sees that corpse face like float up, that is priceless. Also, I mean, you know, we got Leah Thompson, as we'd mentioned, from this film. This is her, you know, breakout. You know, she would then, you know, go on to Traveling Back in Time and fucking ducks after this. So it's that we have Jaws 3 to thank us for giving us Leah Thompson.
Well, I often think of Jaws 3D as in some ways inspiring the Rennie Harlin movie Deep Blue Sea.
Oh yeah,
sure. Yeah.
With Samuel L. Jackson doing his Lou Gossett Jr. So
Totally.
That's right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, speaking of 3D history, this movie seems like it has almost like an homage to the return of the creature. Because they bring the creature
Yes.
from the Black
Yeah.
Lagoon and they want him at an amusement park. So then he's like terrorizing this amusement park and that.
It's Marineland of Florida. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. So
they keep him in a tank and then he breaks his chain and he escapes. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't help but think that this is in some ways like almost like a little bit at least inspired by that sequel and stuff. So, and also happens to be in 3D. So it's pretty interesting. I do love the grenade in the mouth, like how they actually eventually destroy the shark. This hand with the grenade just dangling out. It doesn't make any sense, but it's a lot of fun.
Fitzroy, the photographer, who, is kind of a very sad replacement for Matt Hooper, Hooper's character, but he's his death scene is probably the most grisly death scene in the series outside of Quint. Like the most sort of harrowing, like the inside the mouth and the crunching of the bones and him screaming. I'm like that. It's also kind of comical because it is so over the top, but it is pretty horrifying. But then it is really funny, like him dangling out. The shark actually eats somebody after it's already eaten Fitzroy, and somehow still doesn't swallow him down because they still need him to be dangling out with the grenade. But I do really like that.
Right.
It's just so grotesque. Like the shark spends like a good 10 minutes with this corpse just hanging out of its mouth.
Yeah,
it's pretty great.
Well, and of course, the exploding grenade gives him that opportunity to have that money shot at the end.
Oh yes,
the on the nose. Here's Jaws.
Jaws, yeah, Jaws coming at you. Yeah,
coming at you in 3D.
It's Jaws.
Jaws. We gotta have Jaws coming at the screen if it's 3D.
Yeah.
So yes, I can see the board meeting about that. It's weird. I will say this. I almost think this movie's. I think almost all the Jaws movies are overly criticized in a weird way, but post the original. But I'll say that this movie is I think it's like 14% or something on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't think it's quite that because this movie is entertaining. you can. Yeah. I mean, if somebody had never seen this, we're like, oh, watch it. It's fun, because it's just such a dumb, fun movie.
That said, have you had an opportunity to see the post-converted original Jaws?
No, and I'm dying to.
It was released in 3D.
Yes, I've heard it's incredible.
I know the stereo conversion supervisor, and asked him, "How did this happen?" And he said, during COVID lockdown, Spielberg was trying to keep busy and had always pondered what Jaws would look like in 3D, and figured, well, we're all locked down at home. Now's my chance to actually do it.
Yeah.
So it had a limited release in theaters. It was stunning. It's like seeing Jaws for the first time again. So if you ever have an opportunity to see the converted original Jaws, that's Jaws 3D for me.
Yeah, for sure. The true Jaws 3D. And like I said, it's such a tough act to follow, Jaws. I mean, it is such a perfect, wonderful, incredible film. It's on my probably it's in my top 5 favorite films ever. It's in a lot of people's top 5.
Oh yeah,
it's almost cliche to say one of my favorite films is Jaws. So that's a difficult prospect to make a sequel to, just because it's such a masterpiece and such an incredible film. That being said, I actually weirdly enjoy all of the Jaws movies. As bad as The Revenge is, I laugh my ass off. It is so preposterous and so ridiculous.
This time it's personal.
Michael Caine is just way over. I mean, it's I don't know. I find that movie charmingly bad.
That is an entirely different watching experience. You're going into Jaws: The Revenge with a completely different mindset.
It is the room of Jaws movies. It's so good.
Yes,
but this one is like the in between, because Jaws 2 I'd still say is very confident. Jaws 3 is like a little incompetent, but a lot of fun. And it's kind of dumb fun, which is very perfect for the 80s. But yeah, I don't know. Any other thoughts on Jaws 3 before we move on to our next film?
One last thing. if people want to see it in 3D, they can. That one was restored and put out on Blu-ray in 3D by Universal. If you get the Blu-ray, it doesn't actually say that it's Jaws 3D, but it's on there in 3D.
Oh, nice. So if you have a 3D television...
If you have a 3D television, you can see it in 3D, yeah.
Nice. Wow, very cool. Yeah. All right, folks, you can stream Jaws 3 on Peacock or Starz, but it is also available to pick up, as Eric mentioned, on Blu-ray. And if you have a 3D TV, you can watch it in 3D. How cool. Well, from the shark-infested waters of an amusement park to the battle for survival against a mutant warlord, it's time for Metalstorm, the destruction of Jared-Syn.
In a future that grows ever closer, the fate of our Earth will lie in the hands of one man, a solitary warrior of great courage. His name is Dojin, and he is called the Finder. His enemies will emerge from the underworld to test his strength. Urok, the Cyclopean warlord of the One Eyes, the assassin Baal, half man, half machine, and Jared-Syn, leader and mastermind of the sinister renegades. They will utilize their cruelest weapons. They will exploit their most mysterious powers as they create an epic non-stop action-adventure movie that will challenge your senses. And they will do all this for you in 3D this summer. Metalstorm, the destruction of Jared-Syn in 3D.
All right, Eric, can you synopsize Metalstorm for our audience out there?
I will try. Metalstorm is a very of course, this is the one you gave me to synopsize. It's a very convoluted movie. Okay, so there's this ranger named Dojin in this sort of post-apocalyptic barren world. And he's hunting down this sort of mystical warlord named Jared-Syn. The movie opens, he's attacked by this guy on a flying motorbike. There's a lot of shots of driving this armored vehicle over long periods of time to sort of fill space in the movie. And it's a recurring theme. It's like whenever they realized we're running short, let's throw in just more of the vehicle driving around. So Dojin is this ranger. He gets attacked. He shoots the guy down. He finds this crystal. Now, apparently, in this world, there are all these nomads who mine for crystals. And there's this one father and daughter team who find this really, really rare, valuable crystal in this mine. And then this really hideous-looking guy named Baal, who has sort of a cybernetic modifications. He's got this one sort of extendable robot arm that they repeatedly have him extend directly into the lens of the camera. And he squirts this green juice onto the miner, and he ends up having this sort of psychedelic trip where he goes into another dimension where Jared-Syn kills him. None of this makes any sense yet.
It's Buckaroo Banzai all over again.
So Dojin shows up at the mine. He finds this crystal that they've discovered. The daughter who hid in the cave, so she survived this attack. Her character, Diana, she's played by Kelly Preston. And I should say Dojin is played by Jeffrey Byron. They decide they need to go off together to figure out what this crystal is, and they meet up with this guy that she's done business with, and he examines the crystal and beams this thing through it and discovers it's like this special life crystal that could potentially like free the nomads from Jared-Syn's tyranny. Then Dojin and Diana end up in this cave where she gets transported away from him, and this monster shows up and he fights the monster, and then he goes off to find this prospector he finds him like drunk in this bar. It's played by the incredible Tim Thomerson.
Yes.
And
Thomerson.
they kind of team up to go out and find Diana to rescue her, but they have to go through the land of the one-eyed Cyclops men. And Richard Mall, who was Bull on Night Court, is Hurak, the leader of the Cyclops men. Dojin has to fight him to the death because that's their way. Dojin actually sort of gets the better hand and can kill Hurak, but decides to spare him. So Hurak says, well, now we can be friends. I actually have the Metalstorm press kit here in front of me.
Wow.
Digging deep.
But,
I'll just read their synopsis.
well, there's Rhodes. Tim Thomerson's character
Rhodes.
is named Rhodes.
Right.
He gets like mortally wounded, and Dojin goes off on his own and has a run-in with Baal himself. Baal squirts the green juice on Dojin. Dojin ends up... I'm getting some of this out of order, but Dojin ends up also having a trip in this other dimension, and Jared-Syn is there, and he's going to kill him, but Dojin's bond to Diana is too strong, and he manages to get back. None of this makes any sense at all.
Nope.
Oh, and Baal, the cybernetic squirty guy, is Jared-Syn's son for some reason.
Yes.
I see the family resemblance.
Yeah. Well, Dojin ends up killing Baal and confronting Jared-Syn. There's this whole thing they're doing with this giant crystal that will like make Jared-Syn the supreme overlord of this whole planet. Jared-Syn tries to escape on one of these flying bikes, and Dojin flies after him, and they fly through this box canyon, and it opens up a portal into another dimension that Jared-Syn flies into and escapes. It's kind of open-ended. There's no real resolution to anything.
Yep. Yeah.
So
Bless their hearts, they thought they were going to make this a
Yeah,
franchise.
little franchise in the in the works here for Charles Band.
yeah. Well, it's interesting to note it's a Charles Band movie, but it was put out by Universal.
Yeah, I saw this in the theater. So at the same theater I saw Jaws 3. Actually, I saw this in. So yeah, this was in quite a few theaters. I remember ads for it everywhere. I remember seeing the guy, Ball coming out with the arm, and I was like, well, I got to see that. So,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. Those Ball pointing and squirting his green fluid is a great 3D shot.
It is. Yeah, I remember the 3D very vividly from this film. It was fantastic.
Oh yeah.
It's really well done. A lot of the gags and gimmicks they do for the things that kind of jump out at the screen were really well done in this film.
I'd mentioned earlier my friend who was a projectionist in the 50s. His name is John Rupp-Calvis, and he worked for quite a few years as a stereo specialist for movies. So he was the on-set stereo consultant for this movie, and he made sure that everything was properly aligned, and that things that were popping off the screen did all of that in a way that the audience would, have a really great reaction to it. So the 3D in this movie is really, really well done. I will say they kind of messed it up on the Blu-ray. If you watch the Blu-ray, you'll get a little bit of eye strain because there's a lot of shots that apparently when they scanned it, they didn't bother to realign properly. I've shown this movie in the past with John and sat down with him, and we went through shot by shot and realigned everything because he didn't want people to see it the way it looked on the Blu-ray.
Oh, wow.
At least it is available in 3D in a form where you can see it. Kind of a hot mess, but it's got all these great 3D moments in it.
Yeah, totally. Great. Was this one you'd seen before? I know you'd seen Spacehunter and Jaws 3, but had you seen Metalstorm before? And what did you think of it?
This is the only one I hadn't. In 1983, my parents were taking me to all the 3D movies, but I think this one was rated R, right? That might have been
I think so, yeah.
That was probably why they didn't take 7-year-old Gray to this one. But yeah, and I got to see it in 3D, and like you guys were saying, the 3D was excellent. And it wasn't on Blu-ray. Jason got a digital file of it, so I don't know, maybe it was corrected or something, because it looked great. There was no eye strain. Yeah.
Well, okay. I should say I have very trained eyes for this stuff. So, I often see the errors in 3D things that people
the layman
who
may not
haven't.
notice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was probably just bowled over because I'm not as used to it. I was probably just like, wow, this. But yeah, the 3D was great. But yeah, this one, like I was saying, it's our old friend Charles Band, the king of the mashups, and whereas Spacehunter is Mad Max meets Star Wars, this is clearly Dune. This is Albert and Charles Band's version of Dune, but it's like if Jared-Syn is basically like if we just jump right past any of the hopeful, idealistic versions of Paul Atreides, and we just go straight past anything benefiting humanity, and just go right into him being right into like some amalgam of American con man capitalist. That's like Jared-Syn. So it's like we're just jumping. So it's pretty great for a Charles Band movie. But yeah, and like Ball's toxic splooge that he's shooting at everybody is like the spice from Dune. But instead of interstellar travel, it takes you into this weird dimension where you're face to face with Jared-Syn. So there's so much Dune in this movie, which I really liked because it kind of made it his own thing. Just like he always does. This is cribbed from movies and books and all kinds of other stuff. The nomad characters. And yeah, Hurok, Richard Mole. Again, back to Charles Band. A lot of this goes back to our Capital Dismemberment episode. The DP was Mac Ahlberg, again, who was the DP on Prison. And, I'm sorry, not Prison, Horror Show.
Horror Show, yeah.
Yeah, Horror Show. So a lot of the same old people. Of course, Richard Mole was in House, the first House. He was the Vietnambie, as we call him, the zombie from Vietnam. So it felt, watching it, anytime I watch a Charles Band movie, I feel pretty homey. And, watching a Charles Band movie. Yeah, I enjoyed most of it. Like Eric said, it's a hot mess, but there's so much fun 3D and fun stuff going on. I did enjoy it. And the cast, from Tim Thomerson, the Doll Man himself. Oh, and, Jared-Syn was Papagallo from Road Warrior.
Oh, yeah,
so
yeah.
Yeah, there really are literal Mad Max
Mike
parallels.
Preston, no relation to Kelly Preston.
Right.
Interesting little side note there. If you look through the press kit, the photos of Kelly Preston actually have her real name. It says Kelly Palzas. So in between the time that they did the press photos and the time the movie was released, she changed her stage name to Preston. Interestingly, in a movie where there's another guy with the last name Preston.
Interesting. That's a lot like Billie Jean with two Slaters, where Helen Slater used to be named Schlachter and changed her name. But that's.
Mike Preston's really good in it as this evil, brooding sort of wizard.
Yeah,
Dark
he really
shaman.
is, and which is diametrically opposed to his character in Road Warrior, who's like this wise, gentle, Also with the mashups, the crystals, they're harvesting these crystals, which is also kind of Spice-like. Jared-Syn being this master of this crystal, and that's going to make him this god and everything, is very Dark Crystal-ish. Mm-hmm. And the Dark Crystal came out 1 year before this movie, and I'm like, oh, Charles Band, you just get it all. You just wrap everything that's in the zeitgeist into your I got to admire it. I just really do.
Well, this was written by Alan J. Adler, who had also done Parasite for Charles Band.
Right, his other 3D film. Yeah. I really, I enjoyed this movie quite a lot. I hadn't seen it, I saw it in the theater, and then I saw it also on video several times. But yeah, I really like this one. It's definitely a lot more Mad Max than Star Wars, where like Spacehunter had like kind of a better balance between the two, but this is definitely more in the Mad Max kind of range. And as you'd mentioned, Gray, influenced by Dune and a lot of other things. I hadn't even thought about the Dark Crystal influence, but yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think definitely Charles Band took that from there. I do really like the Richard Band music in this film.
Oh, yeah.
I think the music is actually fantastic.
And
I think he recorded in something like 11 days or something like ridiculous. And it's a really effective score. What's cool about this movie is because it is such a pastiche of so many different weird ideas kind of thrown together that it kind of weirdly works for me. There's a couple of sequences I thought were fantastic. That crystal crystal creature attack after Diana is captured, that is really cool. It looks like hand-drawn animation, this crystal creature thing.
Yeah.
I was wondering how that effect was going to hold up, because I remember it vividly when I was a kid. And I still really like it. It's still really unique. I really love Jared-Syn's bowl cut. That Spock bowl cut he's got is pretty serious. Also, our hero has got to be the sweatiest man in film history.
Yes, I actually have a note about
Drenched
that.
in sweat, like from the opening shot, like after he takes his helmet off. I mean, he's just drenched. You could tell they're just out in the frickin' Arizona desert where it's probably 105 degrees. And they're having him like in heavy leather and in cars that probably aren't air conditioned and all this kind of stuff. There's no dabbing with towels in between takes at the Charles Band pace. So yeah, he is the sweatiest man you've ever seen. You know, there's speaking of pastiche. Yeah, when they meet Tim Timerson, that's a total cantina scene ripoff. Mm-hmm. But it's fun. Yeah. It's fun. It's once again back into the Western and stuff.
Well, and Tim is such a staple of band films that.
And was this their first collaboration together? Because I mean, obviously he's going to be the main guy in Trancers and Dollman and a bunch of other collaborations.
This is pre-Full Moon.
Yeah.
I was thinking, like, is this the first time that they made a film together? Because, this is really, it seems like the seed that kind of started a long-time collaboration. Mm-hmm. But, and that's the thing about that. I mean, because of the actors, too, it's kind of a little elevated above its sort of B-movie kind of qualities, in a way. It's got a pretty decent cast in it. And like I said, like you'd mentioned, Eric, great 3D.
Yeah.
Like the tree branch, like, coming, it's like a totally unnecessary segue shot. I remember that in the theater, like that branch like coming right at my eye.
If anything, the weak link is the opticals of the flying bike thing.
Oh, yes. I was expecting Barry Bostwick from Megaforce to like make a cameo in that. It's like it is like some of the worst compositing I've ever seen.
At least it quickly makes up for it once he goes into the other dimension and it becomes Tron and it's like
right.
That's what I was
once
thinking.
That happens,
like,
that looks phenomenal in 3D.
That's a lot of fun. A total video game. So total
which is
80s
funny
video
because that makes the funny little play on, because like when I saw the name of the movie and I hadn't seen it, I'm like, isn't this a spoiler? The Destruction of Jared-Syn? And then I was like, oh wait, it's not. He doesn't get
destroyed.
He is the one who's doing the destructing.
Yes. You could read it either way. Yeah, for sure. Also, I love that, like, for the Richard Mall fight, like, they didn't even bother with, like, any kind of, like, special prop knife. They just went and got some size. And, like, this'll work. It's like...
that fight was very... I was waiting for the music from the Gorn fight from Star Trek. You know, the ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Yeah, right? It totally is. It's so like that. And kind of on the similar level of fight choreography.
And they actually, looking through the notes here, they shot at Vasquez Rock.
Oh my God!
I could say, of course, and there it is. Yes. I was thinking that too. I was like, is that Vasquez Rocks? Because I'd read
it is.
Of it
is
in Arizona.
No, actually, according to the press kit,
really,
it was
wrong as usual.
Well, I'll tell you what Universal had to say about it. Yeah, production began in February of '83, continued for 7 weeks. Filming took place in Simi Valley, Vasquez Rock, and some work on a soundstage, but the bulk was done 1 or 2 hours outside of the city in an area near Palm Springs.
Crazy. Huh. Interesting. Oh, wow. Yeah, they totally have, like, Cameron, Arizona, and Tinaja's Mountains, Arizona on IMDb and stuff. So, like, I was like, oh, I guess, like, because I was thinking the same thing. I was like, that looks a lot like Vasquez Rocks, but it
totally does.
It's probably wrong on IMDb. I would go by the press kit.
Simi Valley, Vasquez Rock, Palm Springs, and a soundstage.
Fascinating. But a lot of it looks like it's shot inside a quarry of some kind, especially the early stuff. All the driving sequences. I mean, it looks like... And that was one thing I was like, and I'm glad someone else mentioned it. I was just like, oh my God, another driving POV. Uh-huh. There's another one. That's interesting that it was just used to like, okay, we got to get to an 85-minute runtime at least.
Right.
That's so funny. I honestly had kind of a blast watching this, though. It still kind of holds up for what it is, you know. And I think it's elevated by its cast, and I think it's a lot of fun. And I think I'm a little biased too because I had such a great time watching it.
Well, I'll tell you, it is an audience pleaser. It is an audience pleaser. You know, I recently did a screening of it, sort of a piggybacking on the fact that Universal's recent The Fall Guy movie.
Oh yeah,
the movie in the movie was Metalstorm.
Yeah.
No, I haven't. I've heard good things, but I haven't
That's
seen
the
it.
movie they are making in the movie. It is a movie called Metalstorm.
No shit.
Yes.
Yeah. Different plot, but they've...
Yeah. But a sci-fi film. And,
a sci-fi Western movie called Metalstorm. So I did a screening of Metalstorm in 3D recently. And again, this is one, if you get to see it on a big screen with an audience, you're going to have a blast.
Yeah, it's a hoot. I mean, it's just, I just had a really fun time with it, much like Spacehunter, and it was just like, and then it was done. And I was like, well, that was great. Good thing about the 90-minute action adventure movies and stuff that we grew up with. I mean, because they're not trying to bloat out the time, they had to have as many screenings as possible. They had to have these things under 90 minutes, and so they really didn't have a lot of fat on them.
Yeah, this has been definitely one of my favorite episodes, just for that reason. 90-minute, breezy, entertaining movies. Even Jaws 3, which was my least favorite, still was not a problem. 90 minutes, still, woo!
Yeah.
And it does leave the door open if Charles Band ever wants to make Metalstorm 2 The Return of Jared-Syn.
Yeah.
It does, and I'll buy a ticket tomorrow. Yeah. I'll be right there.
I mean, totally. Yeah, if that came out of nowhere, I'd be all for it. So, the sandworm attack was probably one of the hokiest things in the movie.
Oh, it was cute. It was very cute.
It was cute.
But it wasn't quite Dune, though.
No, it was...
No. Little fellas.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. Graboids.
It's a little more graboid than...
Charles Band he's like one of these really efficient directors in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, he's not like fancy and he's not like an auteur, but I find that the movies, I mean, he's produced just like 500 or 600 movies probably at this point, but like the movies he directed, especially back in the 80s, I mean, they're like, I don't know, they're just very competent and kind of like lean and mean, fun B movies. Any other thoughts on Metalstorm?
No, exactly what you said. Super fun. Like, you know what you're getting, and I think you get a little with this one. I think you get a little bit more than what you expect out of Charles Band. Yeah, I think it's one of his better movies.
Yeah, and
totally. We haven't specifically talked about how the production design and effects and everything for the most part in this movie are just they're on a level with Spacehunter and really impressive for.
Yeah, there's some really great makeup effects in this too. I mean, balls.
That
really
arm
cool.
is impressive. That is cool.
And the Cyclops men. Interesting little side note: they've only got one eye, so they could never see the movie in 3D.
All right, so Metalstorm is not streaming anywhere at the moment. That being said, Shout Factory has a Blu-ray out there that includes the film in 3D if you have a 3D television, as we mentioned. All right, well, do we have a favorite film from this month? Eric, do you have a favorite of these 3D films that we discussed this month?
Of these three, I love all my children equally. No, you know what? The 80s 3D movies, and in particular, there were a whole bunch of them in 1983. They're all what I call movies that are so bad that they're wonderful. Mm-hmm. I do really. I mean, Spacehunter has a lot going for it. In the plot, actually does make some sense. Given that, I'd say maybe I lean a little more towards Spacehunter as my favorite of the three, but I'd still take any opportunity to see any of these in a theater with an audience.
Nice. What about you, Gray?
Spacehunter. Yeah.
Spacehunter.
I mean, the fact that it lived up to the memories, with Metalstorm a close second. But yeah, it's solid Spacehunter.
Oh my gosh, I think we have consensus. It's very rare we have this on the show.
Only the second time.
Yeah, Spacehunter for sure. It's kind of Spacehunter was such a wonderful surprise. I thought it was definitely the best script, best dialogue, best character performances, most fun set pieces, most creative set pieces. And it's funny that of the 3D films, it probably had the worst 3D of the three.
Yeah.
But in terms of a 2D experience and just as a movie, I thought it was the best movie, and one that I was just over the moon to revisit because I was like, wow, this is one I should revisit more often. It's absolutely such a blast.
Total blast. In fact, I want to get it even if it's not in 3D. I want to try and get it on physical media. I would watch this regularly. Hopefully, since the last pressing of the Blu-ray is out of print now, someone will pick it up to do a new Blu-ray release. I'd love to see this one actually get properly restored.
Yeah, for sure. All right, now that was your favorite from this month, but do you have an all-time favorite 3D movie? Eric? I'm dying to hear yours.
Yeah.
I'm dying to hear what is your all-time favorite 3D film.
There's a few that really stand out.
Okay, name a few.
No. I can nail it down to a favorite, but I'll lead into it.
Sure.
House of Wax is fantastic, and it's a lot of people's favorite 3D movie. Vincent Price is amazing in it. It's got a great story. It's got great 3D, and it kicked off Vincent Price. His whole career as a horror film guy. Prior to that, he was doing costume dramas.
Yeah.
So it's a real landmark movie, and several years back, Warner Brothers restored that, put it out on Blu-ray, so people can see that if you want to see an example of a really, really great 1950s 3D movie. I'd say as far as a serious 3D movie, there's a picture called Inferno that stars Robert Ryan, Rhonda Fleming. It was 3D Technicolor. And it's sort of a neo-noir about a businessman who gets left in the desert with a broken leg so his wife can go back to LA with her lover and inherit his money. They expect him to die in the desert, but he survives, and then they have to try to find him in the desert and kill him before he gets to the authorities. Great movie. The 3D is fantastic. They make this desert feel both immensely vast and claustrophobic at the same time. It ends with this great sequence inside a cabin on fire.
Wow.
That's a really, really great one to see. It is one that you can track down the 3D Blu-ray for. But my favorite 3D movie of all time is also one of the worst movies ever made, 1953's Robot Monster.
I knew it. Yay. Which,
yes.
For folks out there, I believe you did like a commentary on that film. Is that correct?
Yes. A group called the 3D Film Archive that has done wonderful restorations of 1950s 3D movies and gotten them back out on Blu-ray. Finally was able to restore Robot Monster in 2023, and I was invited to be part of the commentary track. I also got to meet the last surviving cast member. Greg Moffat was 10 years old. He played Johnny in the movie, and he's in his 80s now. For years, he didn't want to acknowledge that as a child actor, he'd made one of the worst movies ever made. But in the last decade, he's really embraced it, and he loves meeting the fans now. And we sat down with him and filmed a 3D interview that's also on the Blu-ray. And it's one of those movies that, it was shot over 4 days on a budget of $16,000 with some of the cheesiest special effects ever. They had a bubble machine on set to blow bubbles at the camera. They have sequences that flash between positive and negative to signify a death ray. They cut in stock footage of stop motion and live lizard dinosaurs from earlier movies for no apparent reason. And there's stock footage of a rocket, and then it cuts to what's supposed to be a space station, but it's clearly just a model of a rocket being held by a hand in a black glove. And I mean, you can see the hand holding it. It's one of these, and of course the title character, robot monster Roman. They hired gorilla performer named George Barrows because he had his own gorilla suit. So that's the monster portion of it, and then they rented a space helmet with these big antennas and had him put that on instead of the gorilla head. So he's robot monster. I can watch it over and over and over again. I love that movie so much.
Nice. You know, I've actually never seen that film, but I need to. The more you talk about it, the more I'm like, I definitely need to see this. This needs to.
I went so far
list.
To bring this full circle. Bob Burns has the original Robot Monster helmet in his collection.
Nice.
So I've had the opportunity to go to his house and hold the real helmet, and he let me take reference pictures. I made my own. The original was paper mache, so I made mine out of paper mache. Nice. And I got an ape suit. So like when I do public screenings of Robot Monster, I do it spook show style. At the end of the movie, I turn on a bubble machine. I come out from behind the audience and menace everyone. Yeah, it's one of those movies that has become part of like the culture of America. Roman, people don't know the movie, but they know the character.
Everyone knows
whether it's
that character.
Whether it's from the Cars music video, or the MST3K did an episode about it,
or just
he shows up on an episode of The Simpsons. Yeah. So it went from being one of the worst movies ever to the Blu-ray release last year, winning a Rondo Award for Best Blu-ray Restoration. And it just got some like Blu-ray marketing award for best Blu-ray of last year. So it's
a real Ed Wood story with that.
The thing to go in, if you're going to watch Robot Monster, the thing to go in thinking about is the whole movie is told through the point of view of the 10-year-old boy. And it actually was made as a kid's movie. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, it's sort of the low-budget version of Invaders from Mars, which is also all told from the point of view of a 10-year-old boy. And when you go in that way and you realize the whole thing is this 10-year-old boy's fever dream, things that don't make sense when you just try to watch it suddenly make sense as, oh yeah, that's what a 10-year-old would think.
Yeah.
You know, the 10-year-old, at the beginning of the movie, he's wearing a space helmet, blowing bubbles at his sister, saying, I'm going to kill you. And then he gets bumped on the head and has this fever dream where there's a robot monster with a bubble machine he's got a space helmet, he's going to kill everyone.
It suddenly becomes an unlikely art film.
Yeah.
Interesting. Gray, do you have a favorite 3D film?
Yeah, if I had to choose, I know one of my favorite in the theater. I'm going to stick to in the theater since I haven't seen a whole lot of 3D movies, so I'm going to stick to the ones that I've seen in the theater. I've seen way fewer than I would like to have. One of the more fun experiences I've had in the theater in the modern era, this is not my favorite, but one of the more fun experiences I had was seeing Piranha 3D with a whole bunch of friends.
Yeah.
Just because that movie is hilarious. But anyway, so Piranha 3D was a lot of fun, and they knew what they were doing, but that is not my favorite. But out of everything that I've actually seen in 3D in a theater, it's a toss-up between Creature and House of Wax, which Eric already mentioned. I would probably go with House of Wax over Creature from the Black Lagoon, although Creature from the Black Lagoon as a movie on its own I would prefer over House of Wax. But for 3D, I'd probably say House of Wax.
Nice. I think mine is film from the early 60s, The Mask. I saw it on TV, and it was part of the 3D, the screenings they'd have at like after midnight and stuff. My dad would always tape them for me. So I watched it, and I would just put on the 3D glasses when he would put on The Mask. But whoa, those 3D sequences are crazy. They're like Dolly-esque. They're like 3D, they're like surrealist art films, and they're super creepy. I remember there's like an eye, like one of those like kind of cloaked figure with like an eye that's coming out, and that was like coming out of the screen, and it was just like so freaking creepy to me as a kid. So the impression that movie made on me was kind of profound. I've kind of taken a lot of those kind of haunting images with me and stuff ever since I saw that film as a kid. So yeah, just from from a pure impact standpoint, definitely
the trippiest 3D movie I've ever seen.
It it had several releases. It was made in '61. It was a Canadian filmmaker named Julian Rothman who had previously made a non-3D exploitation film called The Bloody Brood. So The Mask was the first Canadian feature motion picture to get a wide release, because Warner Brothers picked it up to release in the US, and it was the first Canadian horror movie in 3D. And it ended up being so successful, it was re-released in 1967 and again in 1971, and had a new title, The Eyes of Hell.
Oh, interesting.
That's appropriate title as well.
Yeah.
And actually, it's really interesting, because if you think about it, it very well could have been the inspiration for the Mask comic book that led to the Jim Carrey movie.
Right.
Because the premise is very similar.
Yeah.
There's this ancient mask, and when a character puts it on, they have a psychotic break.
Yeah.
And in this version of the Mask, they then go out and kill people during the psychotic break.
Yeah.
Jim Carrey just turns into this green guy.
Looney Tunes
But
character.
the idea,
Of course, in the comic book, he does that too.
and in the comic book, he does.
Yeah.
So the idea of this ancient mask that turns you into a psychopath actually goes back to this movie.
Yeah.
And what I love is that, they came up with this whole gimmick that most of the movie is just black and white. But when someone puts this mask on, a voice, this booming voice, tells the audience, "Put the mask on now."
Yeah.
And everyone in the audience was given their 3D glasses in the shape of the magic mystic mask. You put your 3D glasses on, and you get to experience the psychotic break that the character's having by going through these really psychedelic sequences, all set in this underworld. You cross the river Styx. You go through this graveyard with hands coming up from the ground. There's this mausoleum with a tomb that gets engulfed in flames. It's crazy stuff. And they actually hired this experimental montage filmmaker named Slavko Vorkapich. I think that's how you pronounce it. Slavko Vorkapich or
Good
Vorkapich. And he wrote these montage sequences. He in fact, he at one time was the chair of the cinematic arts department at USC.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, there were some a good pedigree for what was going into the 3D portions of the movie, and overall the movie's kind of weird. The 2D parts are nothing to write home about. But when
the 3D stuff is incredible.
When it switches to 3D, it's
a whole other film.
Yeah.
I mean, and it sounds like he was like a completely different filmmaker took over, like an avant-garde experimental filmmaker took over those portions, and that's why. And that's what always stuck out to me, because it was such an interesting contrast to be kind of watching this sort of like narrative sort of fold out in a pretty traditional kind of coverage way, and then you put on the 3D glasses, and then you're just completely transported somewhere else.
Oh yeah.
And it was, I don't know, it was wild. It really made an impact on me as a kid, and I think it really showed how powerful 3D could be. And it also helped because I would really get a lot of fatigue watching these 3D movies and stuff, watching them at home with the red and the blue glasses. And with this one, it was fine because they were like shorter sequences.
To be able to take it off.
They were over in like 5-10 minutes, as opposed to
and also
the whole duration of the film.
Because this one was made in 1961 and was actually intended to be viewed with the anaglyph glasses, they planned it that way. It was it was designed so that you'd have these breaks. You weren't wearing a red lens over one eye for 90 minutes,
right, and
a blue lens over the other eye for 90 minutes. So you could readjust.
Maybe they could do changeovers too. So
absolutely, because this would have only been on a single strip.
Yeah.
Interestingly, it has been restored. It is available on a 3D Blu-ray.
Nice.
And for the 3D Blu-ray, the 3D Film Archive went back to the original negatives and did new scans of the left and right separately. If you get the Blu-ray, you can actually watch it on a 3D TV using the polarized or active glasses.
Oh wow, cool.
So the great thing now is like I have screened it several times, and I showed it most recently using polarized projection. So it looked better than it ever did when it was in its original release.
Yeah. Wow. Well, let me know next time you have that screening. I would love to revisit that film.
Sure. Yeah. It's definitely one to see again. And we've said that about all of these, but this is one that plays so well in a crowded auditorium.
I'm sure.
Because everyone's sharing the experience of putting the glasses, putting the mask on, and taking the mask off, and it's just so much fun.
Awesome. Well, Eric, besides 3D Space, what else do you have going on at the moment that you would like folks to know about?
Well, I am so immersed in 3D. Like I said, the 3D Space Museum is this nonprofit museum that pretty much only really keeps going through the generosity of the people who come to visit and make donations. Put most of my full-time efforts into keeping this museum up and running. That said, I actually just got to do something really cool. There's a volume of graphic novel stories, all sort of inspired by Robot Monster, that's going to be coming out very soon. And I was invited to write the foreword for it.
Oh, nice.
So I actually wrote like a 4-page spread, comic book style. The foreword will also be a graphic novel about how Robot Monster got made, how it was considered the worst movie and in the 70s won the Golden Turkey Award, and then how it found a cult following and is now a beloved 3D movie. So that's really cool, and I'm looking forward to the book coming out. Also, Robot Monster related, I'm helping an independent filmmaker launch a campaign to make a sequel to Robot Monster in 3D.
Oh, nice.
So
awesome.
hopefully that'll get to happen, and it's Robot Monster set in the future.
Awesome.
So we'll see how that goes, and then I 3D is my life, so I'm doing all kinds of consulting about 3D, and I do 3D movie screenings all over Southern California. That's all stuff people can find out about by visiting the museum of the website for 3D Space.
And folks, I'll put the link to Eric's 3D Space in the show description as well. So make sure if you are in LA or if you're visiting LA, make your appointment and check out some of the exhibits there. I think it'll be really worth your time. It's a really unique space here in Los Angeles. All right. Eric, my friend, thank you so much for coming on our show. This has been so educational. I've learned so much today, about 3D, the history of 3D, and the history of the films we discussed as well. It's been really fascinating and an absolute blast. Thank you so much for...
blast, man. Thanks.
Brad and Gray, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It was great to reconnect with you guys. And it's been really, really fun chatting.
Totally, yes. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Well, next month, folks, it's our favorite time of the year. We're getting into spooky season, so we're diving into slasher films that take place on different holidays. We will discuss Mother's Day from 1980, My Bloody Valentine from 1981, and April Fool's Day from 1986. Gray, have you seen all of those films?
I have. I've seen all three of them.
I figured you had. I knew you were good for that. Fantastic. Well, it's interesting. We will also be joined by fellow filmmakers, the producer and director team of Blood Moon Pictures, PJ Starks and Eric Huskisson. They also have a film playing at Horror Hound, a film called New Fear's Eve. And they are going to join Gray and myself for our first live in person. We always do these over Zoom, so we'll actually all be in the same room doing a conversation about these films. So
stinky hotel room.
I'm excited to do it. It'll be a totally different experience, and these are perfect guests and stuff to discuss these films since they make holiday slasher films themselves. Awesome. Well, I'm pumped to talk about these films. They are all really entertaining in their own right. So, folks, make sure you follow us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Until next time, be kind as we rewind.